Peace be with you. Friends, it's always important to watch Jesus as he dines. Dining is a most important biblical symbol. God created us out of love and for the sake of sharing his life. The more we surrender to him, the more we are connected to each other. This coherence of divinity and humanity, God's grace flowing into us, we accepting that grace and allowing it to overflow to others, is beautifully symbolized by the image of the sacred meal. Think of the best convivial gathering you've ever been part of. Whether it's a wedding banquet or a Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas. Everyone in a good mood, everyone cheerful, food being served and shared, good cheer, good stories, everyone feeling this togetherness, linked to God by prayer. Think of the last time you had a meal like that. That's the biblical image of the good life, of what God wants for us. Look throughout the Old Testament, the importance of the sacred meal. When God draws his people from slavery to freedom, he tells them to sit down and have a meal, the Passover supper. And then he enjoins upon them the command to repeat that supper every year as the sign of their identity. Their shared supper is a sign of God's solidarity with them and their solidarity with each other. The holy meal. Think, too, of that great image. I've often spoken of it. You'll find it in the book of the prophet Isaiah, the image of the holy mountain. There all the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord. The mountain is a place of peace, of nonviolence, where you beat your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks. It's the place where the opposites come together. Lion and lamb will lie down together. But this holy mountain is also the place, Isaiah tells us, of a festive meal, where God serves juicy meats and pure choice wines. You see, it's the sacred banquet. All the tribes of the world come together in peace and nonviolence, cooperation, and there God lavishes upon them a banquet of his grace, and that grace is now shared with one another. Remember, too, in the Bible, our trouble began with a bad meal. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God tells Adam and Eve, but they eat. Grasping at grace, grasping at the divine life. What did it lead to? It led to all the disruption and violence and division of our sinful world. But the sacred banquet, that's what God wants. Now, against this background, we can see why Jesus, Yahweh made flesh, makes eating and drinking so central to his own ministry. Again and again, he engages in what the scholars call open table fellowship. At Jesus' table, everyone's welcome. Men and women, sick and healthy, saints and sinners. This is a symbol of Yahweh's desire to gather his people together in love and fellowship. Listen, what the Passover meal symbolizes, what Isaiah dreamed about, became a concrete reality in the meals of Jesus. And the greatest of these meals took place the night before he died. And whenever we gather at the Mass, we come together from all different backgrounds, all different walks of life. We come together around this sacred meal. We are fulfilling this aspiration of the Bible. Okay. All of that is an introduction to our gospel for today. We're meant to watch very closely what happens at meals where Jesus is eating. We will learn something about what he wants and what he doesn't want. And to learn what Jesus wants and doesn't want is to learn what God wants and doesn't want. Now, listen to what we hear in the gospel today. As Jesus sits down to eat, quote, The people were observing him carefully. How soon this sets in. How soon this sets in from the time we're little kids observing each other carefully. I want you to compare two experiences. The first one is you're lost in a conversation, just following it wherever it leads. You're talking to a good friend. You're pursuing a fascinating topic, and you're just following the words and the arguments as they go. You've forgotten about yourself. You're not observing your friend. You're just following the flow of the conversation. Now, compare that to this experience. You're having a conversation, but you're watching yourself have it. You're very attentive to the impression you're making, how you're doing, and you're carefully observing your conversation partner. See if he's making any mistakes. See what he's up to, what he's saying. What's the difference between the two? The first one is joyful, graceful. The second one is miserable. Because in the first one, you are lost in reality. In the second one, you are distanced from reality. You're preoccupied in a fussy way. Why do we do this to ourselves? Why do we watch each other and watch ourselves? Why were they watching Jesus at the home of the Pharisee? Here's the answer. We do so, and they did so, out of an obsession with honor. Honor, glory, praise. I've told you before, Thomas Aquinas says the four things we typically desire: wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. As I say, very early on, we learn how to play this game. Who's up? Who's down? Who's in? Who's out? Who's impressing the crowd? Who's letting the crowd down? It happens among little tiny kids. Parents know this. Watch little kids at play. When they're lost in the play, they're joyful. They've forgotten about themselves. They're not watching themselves or anybody else. They're just lost in whatever they're doing. That's when they laugh spontaneously. That's when it's joyful. But so often, even when little kids play, they are watching themselves and their friends. Who's up? Who's down? Who's being noticed? Who's cool? Who isn't? Who's in? Who's out? Watch it happening in schools. When the honor of an award or recognition is more important than the joy of learning. You know, when a kid is just caught up in the joy of learning something new, mathematics or reading or history, he's just following this new wonderful subject that's been opened up to him. That's one thing. But then he gets preoccupied with honor. Who gets the highest grade? Who gets noticed? Who has the teacher's approval? It happens, of course, all the time on the sports field. Anyone that's played sports knows the sheer joy of getting lost in the rhythm of a game. You're playing football, you're playing baseball, you're playing tennis or golf, and you're just lost in the beauty of it. That's when you're alive. But when you start fussing about how you're doing, how you're being noticed, what impression you're making, the joy is drained away. It happens, adults know this, at your place of business. Who's rising up the ladder? Who just got that promotion? Who has a better office? Why is the boss paying more attention to him than to me? It can happen within a marriage. It's one of the ways a marriage falls apart, by the way. The spouse is no longer in love with each other, but watching each other, jockeying for position. I mentioned the first great problem with this, how it distances you from reality. Instead of being lost in reality, you're distanced from it. You're watching it. That's why you're so unhappy in this situation. But can I mention a second problem? When you are preoccupied with honor, it puts your life utterly in the hands of other people. What you're saying when you're obsessed with honor is, my joy depends on you. Only when you approve of me will I be happy. I'm out of control then. I need you and your approval to be happy. Oh, but Christians, listen to me here. The fickle crowd, are you kidding? You put your life in the hand of the crowd, of your friends, of the circle of people around you, with their ever-changing expectations and likes. Does the crowd typically praise the right people for the right reasons? Are you kidding? Who's most honored in our society? Saints? People of extraordinary generosity, spirituality, prayer, decency? Are you kidding? Who's honored in our society? Silly pop stars, fools, immoral jerks tend to be the ones that the society honors. When you hand your life over to such a crowd, God help you. When you place your life in the hands of those who elevate the very worst people, what will you become? This is what Jesus notices at this meal. What he's implying is one of the things that breaks up the sacred meal that God intends for his human family is just this preoccupation with honor. And so he tries to interrupt the interruption. He notices the game that people play at meals. They take the highest position. They want to make sure everyone sees them. They want to make sure, oh, he's the most important guest here. Well, now, we all recognize this. We all do it all the time. Jesus says, interrupt that. Do the opposite. Take the lowest place. Endeavor not to be noticed. Endeavor not to stand out. And then, I love this, he pushes it even further. Sometimes, perversely, our very generosity can be a lightly disguised quest for honor. What I mean is, I give a great banquet. To whom? To those who can return the favor. To those who will invite me back to a great meal. I'm loving them that they might love me. Well, that's just a disguised egotism, a disguised quest for honor. So he says, interrupt that too. When you throw a dinner or a banquet, a party, invite those who can't invite you back. Invite the poor, the bedraggled, the marginalized, the hopeless. Invite those people because they can't invite you back. You see what he's doing? He's trying to break us of an addiction. We get addicted to honor just as we get addicted to drugs or to sex or to alcohol or anything else. He wants to break us of this addiction that we might, listen, be able to enter into that holy banquet. That's what God wants for us. Let's get over our obsession with honor. And God bless you. Peace be with you. Friends, from at least the time of Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud, a standard critique of Christianity is that it advocates pie in the sky when you die. It's an otherworldly system that encourages escapism and a troubling indifference to the struggles of the world. You'll hear, by the way, much the same thing from many of the so-called new atheists. They're not really very new at all, but these new atheists who, with the help of their legion of media supporters, are bad-mouthing religion today. The one rather serious problem with this theory is it hasn't a thing to do with biblical Christianity. And our readings for today, for this second Sunday of Easter, are especially helpful, I think, in clarifying this matter. Our first reading is taken from the 4th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. And what it is an idealized picture of the early church. It gives us a kind of snapshot of what that early group of Jesus' followers was about. Now, if Freud and Marx and Feuerbach are right, religion is just pie in the sky when you die, wishful thinking about some heavenly world, these first devotees of the risen Jesus would be gazing up to heaven, turning with relief from the struggles of this world, pining for their own ascension. But here's the point. We see none of that. Instead, these first Christians were deeply interested in the things of this world and in establishing a community of justice. Again, that's the critique, isn't it, from Marx and company, is Christians aren't concerned with justice because we're always pining after heaven. We ignore the concrete conditions of suffering in this world as we long for heaven. But that's not true. That's not true. In the early church, they're deeply concerned with justice. How do we know? We hear that they placed their goods at the feet of the apostles. They sold their goods, that they placed the proceeds at the feet of the apostles so that things could be more fairly and equitably distributed. The result, and again, this is an idealized account, but the result was, quote, there was no needy person among them. So again, if these people were simply hankering after heaven, why in the world would they be so concerned with economic justice? We find something similar in our second reading, which is taken from the first letter of John. This extraordinary letter, by the way, we're reading it during the Easter season. Take the time, alone or with your family maybe, to read the first letter of John. It's an extraordinary little thing. You can read it in one sitting, but it's filled with the theology of the church. But in the passage for today, John tells his little Christian community that they who believe in Jesus have been begotten by the Father, so that now they share in the sonship of Jesus. Okay, so far we say that sounds so spiritual, even rather otherworldly. But then we come to this. Listen. Whoever is begotten by God conquers the world. And the victory that conquers the world is this faith of ours. Let me say that again. I'm quoting now directly from the letter. Whoever is begotten by God conquers the world. And the victory that conquers the world is this faith of ours. Now, just notice, friends, how strange these words are. John is talking here not to a mighty army, not to an imperial force, but to a little gathering of beleaguered and persecuted Christians. There was no mighty international organization, no Vatican, no impressive tradition of art and intellectuality. There was just this little group. And yet, he can tell them that they have conquered the world. Again, stay with this to understand how strange it is. That means they've conquered Rome. They've conquered the powers. They've conquered the greatest forces on the planet. Notice, please, he does not say, you have escaped from the world. He says, you've conquered it and are therefore presumably ready to reign. He means these Christians, through their faith, have a decisively important role to play in the reconfiguration of society. They are to remake the world. Strange, isn't it? Doesn't make a lick of sense on Marxist grounds or Freudian grounds. And where does this confidence come from? What precisely made these first believers so eager to participate in the remaking of the world? Here's the answer. It was the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. That's why we're looking at these readings in the Easter season. It was the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead that gave them this enormous confidence to remake the world, to strive for a more just society. It gave them the confidence to reign in the world. Now, notice I said the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Here's something, friends, I feel so strongly about. We are, to an extraordinary degree, influenced, whether we know it or not, by the philosophy of Plato. In these matters of soul and body, of spirit and matter, and in the meaning of salvation, we are, whether we know it or not, very Platonic. Here's what I mean. Even a great many Christians today would hold that at death, the soul escapes from the body to remain in a purely spiritual realm with God. Now, again, this might be Plato's fantasy, but it's not Christian hope. Our hope is not for the escape of the soul from the body, and that's it. Our hope, rather, is for the resurrection of the body and the renewal of creation. The coming, to use biblical language, of a new heavens and a new earth. What's that phrase now up and down the New Testament? You find it echoed in the Old Testament as well. A new heavens and a new earth. That's what God is holding out to us. We don't want to escape from the world. We want to see it transformed under God's grace and with our cooperation. Now, at the end of time, sure, that's the fullness of it, but Jesus' resurrection, his bodily resurrection in the world now, gives us the courage and the impetus to begin. That even now, by our works of love, charity, justice, by our willingness to oppose the powers of the world, with our confidence that in Christ we've conquered the world, we can begin even now to cooperate with the emergence of the new heavens and the new earth. All this confidence comes from the strange and disquieting fact that stands at the origin of Christian faith, this resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Jesus died and was then resurrected in his body. A renewed, elevated, transfigured body to be sure, but still a body, inhabiting space and time. He was, as Paul put it, the first fruits of those who had fallen asleep. He was the foretaste and promise of what would come for all of us at the end of time. That's Christian hope. That's resurrection faith. And that's why it gives us such confidence even now to participate in the great work of God. Now, friends, it's against that background that we can best understand the story of doubting Thomas. That's our gospel for today. Story we all know well. The other disciples are in the upper room when Jesus appears. They see him, they rejoice, but Thomas is not there. They tell him the story, and he famously balks. Unless I can put my finger in the wounds in his hand, unless I can put my hand in his side, I will not believe. Now here's a point I want to make. To his great credit, Thomas gets it. What I mean is, he understands what his friends meant when they spoke of Jesus' resurrection. He knew they were not talking about a journey to heaven. He knew they weren't saying, oh, he died, but his soul went to be with God. He knew they weren't talking about a subjective experience. He knew they weren't talking about some spiritual vision. Thomas knew, and that's at the heart of his doubt, he knew they were talking about a bodily event. That's what resurrection would have meant to a first century Jew. He just couldn't bring himself to believe it. But see, again, stay with what he knew they were saying. That's the important thing here. And how wonderful then that Jesus proves precisely this bodiliness to Thomas. When Thomas is there and Jesus returns, he says, "Put your finger in my wound. Put your hand in my side." When Thomas sees this, he fully gets it. What he sees is this resurrection fact. And what's born in him is the resurrection faith of the church. And in light of that, Thomas is given the greatest one-liner in the Bible: "My Lord and my God." Isn't that wonderful? Who is Jesus? Oh, there's all kinds of points of view. People, say he's this and that. He's Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. They think he's a great teacher. Some think he's just a blasphemer. There's all these different views. Who is the one at the end of the biblical revelation who fully and finally gets it? It's this Thomas who can say, "My Lord and my God." What he sees in Jesus, what he confesses is, this is God's intention from the beginning of salvation history, to bring about a new heavens and a new earth, the first fruits of which is Jesus risen from the dead. And friends, this is the faith that gives the lie to Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud, and all the atheists today who say that we're just about pie in the sky when you die. No, we're about a new heavens and a new earth. Commencing with the resurrection of Jesus. Something that we participate in even now, that we cooperate with even now through our works of love, justice, and charity. That's resurrection faith. And that is our call to cooperate with it. And God bless you.
Peace be with you. Friends, recently I've been reading a lot from one of my favorite writers of the 20th century. Her name was Iris Murdoch. Iris Murdoch was an Irish novelist and philosopher. And she wrote in both genres, both in fiction and nonfiction, at a very high level of sophistication. Her novels are wonderful. They're funny and they're strange and they're very deep and thoughtful. And her philosophy is very rich and very penetrating. So I recommend first that you read Iris Murdoch. You might have heard of her in recent years. She died of Alzheimer's disease after a very long struggle with it. And many people were caught by this irony of this very brilliant woman who was just gradually, losing her intellectual powers. Her husband, John Bailey, wrote a lovely little book called Elegy for Iris, which is a reflection on those years. Anyway, Iris Murdoch had a very dark view of human nature. She was something like a latter-day Augustine in the way she viewed human beings. She said, "By nature, we're pretty self-absorbed. We tend to look at the world through the distorting lens of our own egotism, our own desires, our own selfishness." And I think she's pretty much right about that. The best moments in life, she said, are those rare moments when that egotism is broken through. When something so confronts us and so shakes us that we break out of our self-regard and actually see the world as it is. Those are splendid and rare moments. She gives 3 examples, and I find each one really fascinating, of how this happens, when this happens. The first one is the experience of learning a foreign language. Now, many of you listening to me have gone through this experience. Maybe it's in high school or college, studying a language. Maybe more elaborately, going over to a foreign country and really wrestling with the complexity of it. But here's the thing that she saw. When you're learning a foreign language, the foreign language doesn't care one whit about you. The foreign language is not there to make things easy for you. It's not trying to adjust to your needs and your desires and your expectations. That language just stands out there in its sheer objectivity. It doesn't mind if you learn it, but it's not there to make it easy for you. You are forced, when you're studying a foreign language, into a great stance of humility. Now, I remember in my years of struggling with French, which is the language I came to know best. Eventually, I studied in France and really learned it well. But when I was first beginning in high school and college, there you're wrestling with these complex verb forms. Our English language grammatically is actually relatively easy, but you're wrestling now with the verb forms of French. They're hard enough. And you think you got a handle on those, and then you discover all the irregular verbs, all the verbs that don't follow the regular rules. And then you got to learn all those independently. And then you make your way to the end of that, and then you discover the subjunctive mood. You got to learn a whole different set of forms. And after a while you say, can't this be a little bit easier? Can't this be a little less complicated? And the language, as it were, looks back at you and says, I don't care. I'm not here to make your life easy. If you want to learn French, then you got to subject yourself to French. I remember now when I went over to France to do my studies, I had a pretty good knowledge of the grammar, and I had been speaking it a little bit, and I was okay, but not brilliant by any means. I remember my first couple of weeks in Paris. I found myself at a cafe, and it was very busy. Over the table came this French waiter. And if you've been to Paris, you know that sometimes the waiters aren't the nicest people in the world, They're not the most patient people. So over the table came this waiter, and he said, well, yeah, can I have your order? At that moment, as this waiter was looming over me, I forgot everything. I forgot the verbs, the irregular verbs, the subjunctive, the past participle. I forgot all my grammar. And there I was kind of babbling away at the table. My point is, at that moment, for me, that waiter represented the sheer demanding objectivity of the French language. To learn it, as everyone knows, you've got to become a child, which means you've got to break out of your little world and your self-regard and humble yourself before this reality. For Iris Murdoch, this is a breakthrough moment when reality confronts you. Her second example is also fascinating. She said, this happens when a great work of art confronts you. Now, there's schlocky art. What I mean is art whose purpose is just to divert you or to entertain you. Now, nothing wrong with that. The end of a long day, I don't mind sitting watching some silly sitcom that just entertains me, But that's not great art. That's schlocky art. That's art that just kind of confirms you in your attitudes. What does great art do? I mean like the Sistine Ceiling, Dante, Rembrandt's portraits, many of Picasso's paintings, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, great art. What it does is it grabs you, it gets your attention, and it shakes you into a whole new way of perceiving things. You're not so much entertained by the Sistine Ceiling as you're overwhelmed by it. They say that when Michelangelo was working on the Sistine Ceiling, great artists, and Rome was filled with great artists at that time, they would sneak in, because it was locked up, but they would sneak in, and they'd look up at the ceiling, and they were just astounded by it. They never realized, first of all, at the level of technique that anyone could do such things, but secondly, and more importantly, the vision of reality that Michelangelo was displaying, they had never imagined before. It seized them. It shook them. It changed them. That's my experience of listening, let's say, to Beethoven. Beethoven's great symphonies, like the Ninth especially. Changes you. You're a different person after that. You read a comic book, you look at some schlocky TV show, you're not a different person. I mean, you're just entertained. Great art, though, grabs you by the lapels and it shakes you. A couple years ago, I was reading Rolling Stone magazine, which is a great popular music magazine. And they asked a number of rock stars, let's say from the 50s and 60s and 70s, what was the first song that really shook your world? And I love that question. It's a good question. And it's right on what Iris Murdoch's talking about. There are a lot of songs you listen to that are, fun and they're entertaining. But there's some songs that shake your world, that rearrange your consciousness, that make you imagine things totally differently. Great works of art shake your world and rock your world. They break through your complacent subjectivity. Third example, and now we're getting a little bit closer to the gospel. Her third example is when somebody demands your compassion. Here's what I mean. You're going through your day, doing your ordinary things, seeking your goods and so on. And suddenly you see somebody. Maybe it's a homeless person. Maybe it's someone who's hungry. Maybe it's someone who's lost. And suddenly their face so breaks into your consciousness, it so seizes you with its demand that you know that you have to drop your plans. You have to drop your enterprise. And you have to respond to that person. Listen, not because it's good for you. Not because it advances your career. Not because it makes you look better. But you must respond to that person because that person's broken into your world with his demand. When the other calls forth from us real compassion, our world is rocked, changed, upended, overwhelmed. Learning a foreign language, being seized by a great work of art, being called to compassion. All three of those are kinds of spiritual exercises. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, because of our gospel for today. That well-known parable that Jesus tells about the Pharisee and the publican. Listen. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, with head unbowed, prayed in this fashion: I give you thanks, O God, that I am not like the rest of men, grasping, crooked, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. Now the Pharisee, and we know from the Gospels, the Pharisees were publicly righteous people. That was their purpose. They wanted to live the law in a publicly visible way so as to edify the people. Don't think of them automatically as bad guys. They weren't. They were righteous people. But listen to how he prays. With head unbowed. He's not overwhelmed by God. He's not allowing God to break into his world, but rather with utter confidence, he strides into the temple and with his head unbowed. I always think of the way Michael Jordan stepped on the basketball court, the way Derek Jeter steps on a baseball field, the way Eric Clapton walks onto the stage. People who are totally in command of their field, utterly cocky and confident. That's the way this man enters the temple. Sure of himself, cocky. And then how he prays. I give you thanks, O God, that I'm not like the rest of men. I'm not like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithe on all I possess. What's his prayer? It's not a prayer at all. It's an exercise in self-congratulation. Not a prayer at all. Real prayer is like learning a foreign language. Real prayer is like confronting a great work of art. Real prayer is like the call to compassion. What I mean is, it's a confrontation with the God who breaks into your world, upsets your plans, turns things upside down, makes a demand on you. This man is way too protected. His self is encased in a carapace of self-regard. Then listen now to how the publican prays. The other man, however, kept his distance, not even daring to raise his eyes to heaven. All he did was beat his breast and say, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Now that's prayer. That's real prayer. He has, and you can see it in his body, in his not even raising his head, in his beating his breast. You can see in his bodily moves that this man is overwhelmed by God. This man has given the glory to God, has allowed God to shape him and turn him upside down. And he knows, Lord, I'm a sinner, have mercy on me. Real prayer is always a self-overwhelming act. I'll close with this. The church has taken in this man's words in one of its great prayer forms, that simple Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. That prayer, that simple prayer, prayed over and over again, is the cornerstone of much of the monastic life in the Eastern Church. Pray it. I'd urge you, pray it. It allows God to break into your life. It allows you to escape from your self-regard and to have this massive experience of the reality of God. When that happens, you're really praying. God bless you.
Peace be with you. Friends, our gospel for today has to do with Jesus' healing of a leper. And the gospel is coupled with a passage from the book of Leviticus, dealing with the whole issue of leprosy. Now, from the time I was a kid, passages like this one have been interpreted really along these lines. There aren't many lepers around today, but there are a lot of people that we treat as lepers, people who are social outcasts and pariahs. Jesus is welcoming and inclusive toward the leper, and so we should be welcoming and inclusive toward the lepers, symbolically speaking, in our society. Now, I've got nothing particularly against that way of reading the passage, but, I've heard that homily so many times, and I suspect you have too. I'm also pretty sure that this is not what a first century Jew would have been thinking about as he read this account in the Gospels or meditated on the book of Leviticus. What did it mean? What did it mean for someone in that time? Well, leprosy frightened people in ancient times, as contagious and mysterious diseases frightened people up until the modern period. But more than this, it rendered somebody unclean, ritually unclean, and therefore incapable of engaging in the act of worship. It is not accidental, by the way, that the person who would do the examining of the patient in ancient Israel would be a priest. So you go back to the book of Leviticus, go back to this chapter 13 of Leviticus, you see these elaborate instructions given to how the priest ought to examine someone to determine whether he or she had leprosy. Well, why the priest? Well, he was the person who was monitoring the whole process of Israelite worship, very much including the question of who could or couldn't participate in the temple worship. So that's the focus, it seems to me, of this whole question of leprosy. Now, flash forward to Jesus' time. We've seen, and I've pointed out many times, that one of the principal tasks of the Messiah of Israel was to gather the scattered tribes, to call together as one all those who have been scattered by exile, by warfare, by sin, by their own rebellion against God. The Messiah would call Israel together because only a gathered Israel could fulfill its mission of in turn gathering the tribes of the world to what? The true worship of God. Now there's that scene I've commented upon many times. Mount Zion, on the top of which was the temple. Mount Zion acts as a kind of magnet to all the nations. When the rightly ordered priestly people, Israel, would worship God there, then they, by the very purity of their worship, would in turn gather the tribes of the world, so that the whole human family would worship God aright. Now, with this in mind, we consider the second great task of the Messiah, and that was to cleanse the temple, to make Jerusalem again a place of rightly ordered praise. And we've seen, therefore, when Jesus comes into the holy city at the climax of his life, he does precisely that. He interrupts the false worship of the temple, and he seeks to establish right praise. Now, in light of these two tasks of the Messiah, it's very instructive to revisit many of the healings of Jesus. Think of that woman in Mark's Gospel with the hemorrhage. who'd been sick for many, many years, had gone to doctor after doctor, but only got worse. She finally reaches out and she touches the tassel of Jesus' cloak and she's cured. Well, see, she's complaining not simply of a physical malady. The hemorrhage rendered her ritually unclean and hence unable to worship. Or think of the woman who was bent over for many years, and Jesus allows her to stand up straight. Well, see, standing up straight was the attitude of worship. Bent over, she was unable to give God proper praise. Think of the man described in Mark's Gospel with the withered hand. The same problem. Someone who was so physically deformed was ritually unclean. And so the same is true of the leper from today's Gospel. Everyone knew the restrictions laid out in the book of Leviticus. They knew that this leper was incapable of worshiping. And so, as this man kneels before Jesus and begs for a cure, he is not simply concerned about his medical condition. He was an Israelite in exile from the temple. And hence, listen now, hence he was a very apt symbol of the general condition of scattered, exiled, wandering Israel. In curing him, Jesus was, symbolically speaking, gathering the tribes and bringing them back to the worship of the true God. He was not just the marginalized in a generic sense. He was Israel incapable of right worship. And that's why Jesus says to the man after he cures him, "Go, show yourself to the priest." In other words, go back to the temple from which you have been for so long exiled. Go show yourself to the priest. Go back to the place of right worship. Okay, now, with all of that background in mind, I'm going to suggest a symbolic reading of this story, but a little different from that customary one I mentioned at the outset. I'm going to propose that the leper stands here. Now, for all of us listening in the year 2009, the leper stands here not so much for just the socially ostracized, but for those of us who have wandered away from right worship. Those of us who are no longer able or willing to worship the true God. As I've said to you many times before, the fathers of Vatican II wanted to intensify and deepen the liturgical experience of ordinary Catholics. Vatican II, in many ways, comes up out of that rich liturgical movement in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. Figures like Romano Guardini in Europe, Reinhold Hillenbrand in this country, Virgil Michael, many others. What they were calling for was a revival of the liturgy to bring people in to experience more profoundly what was happening at the Mass. They wanted a rejuvenated Mass. And so the Vatican II documents are filled with lessons on the centrality and indispensability of the liturgy, which they call famously the source and summit of the Christian life. But friends, what followed Vatican II? If I can put it this way, a mass exodus from the Mass. A mass exodus from the Mass. Now, mind you, I want to be very clear about this. I'm not blaming the Council for this, just the contrary. If you had told the fathers and theologians at Vatican II that 50 years later, only 25% of American Catholics would be attending Mass, and barely 10% of European Catholics, they would have been flabbergasted. That would have gone completely contrary to their own intentions vis-a-vis the Mass. What happened? And what do we do Why are so many today, like the leper in the gospel, away from the temple, away from right worship? Well, there are many ways we can answer that question. You can look at it sociologically, politically, culturally, theologically. What's so important about worship? To worship is to order the whole of one's life toward the living God. And in doing so, to become interiorly and exteriorly rightly ordered. Let me say that again. I think it's so central to our theology of the liturgy and worship. When you worship the true God, you have ordered all the powers in you toward the true God. You become the person you're meant to be. Mind, will, imagination, body, energies, passions, everything in you, ordered to God, now become rightly ordered to each other. More to it, when all of us worship the true God together, we become among ourselves rightly ordered. Mount Zion, true pole of the earth, there all the tribes go up. Well, that's true even now. We come together cohesively around the common praise of God. To worship is to signal to oneself what one's life is finally about. When you worship, you know what you're about, what you're for. Worship is nothing that God needs. God doesn't need our praise. But it's very much something that we need. St. Augustine said that we can uncover the nature of a society very easily by asking one simple question. What do the people in this society worship? Go back to his great text, The City of God, where he examined the Roman culture of his own time. He said that Rome had fallen precisely because it worshiped the wrong gods, gods who were vain and petty and violent. And so the people became vain and petty and violent. We become like unto what we worship. Paul Tillich, the modern theologian, said, the key to understanding a person is to uncover his ultimate concern. Just another way of saying what he worships. What do you worship? If it's not the living God, you've wandered into a land of exile. You have become, in fact, unclean. I'm going to press that connection now between the leprosy of the man in the gospel and the uncleanness of those who stay away from the worship of the true God. We become disordered if we worship pleasure, money, power, honor, the things held up by the culture. You say, well, the Mass is tedious, it's boring, doesn't speak to me, that's why I stay away from it. Well, so what? The Mass is not meant to entertain you. It's meant to order you. It's meant to straighten you out. It's meant to cleanse and purify you. The Mass is the place where Jesus, even now, continues to gather the tribes around him. The Mass is the place where even now the temple is cleansed. The Mass is the place where we become rightly ordered in the presence of God. Keep that in mind, friends, as you meditate upon this man who knelt before the Lord and asked to be cleansed. And God bless you.